welcome to our 11:30 a.m. capsule entitled Tolkien and the Old Testament. This capsule is being presented by Dr. Joel D. Ruark. And Dr. Ruark he earned his PhD in Old Testament from Stellenbosch University in South Africa and has been involved with a smattering of Bible-related projects throughout his career. He specializes in Hebrew linguistics from a cognitive semantic perspective, and his specific research focus is on the metaphorical and theological uses of the concept of light in the Old Testament and other Near Eastern literature and iconography. He takes a strong secondary interest in the development of Christian theology and spirituality during the medieval period. This particular capsule of Tolkien in the Old Testament is in our general humanities sector, and it is confirmed for June 2025. And we're really excited to have you here. I'm going to leave it over to you, Dr. Ruark.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. Can everyone hear me and see me okay? Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides that are going to yeah, I need this one. Okay. I have some slides that are going to accompany my presentation today. Although, hang on just a minute. I want this screen here. All right, great. Now, is everyone seeing the title slide? However, I can't see you anymore. Hang on just a minute. No, it's okay. I can't see anybody, but that's all right. I don't want to waste time. Okay. My course is going to be called Tolkien in the Old Testament. And it's going to be offered in June. And as she said, I earned my PhD in Old Testament. So I'm coming to this topic from an Old Te as a like a in the biz of the Old Testament, and as a Tolkienist, as a personal hobby of mine. And I realized that probably most everyone in here is going to be approaching more this topic more from the Tolkien side, um, which is just fine. I kind of got interested in Tolkien in the Old Testament, kind of by chance, if chance you call it, because when I was started Hebrew, which is of course the language of the Old Testament, I picked up the Tolkien Reader, and I started working through, especially Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, at the same time as I was learning Hebrew. And what I discovered was that as I was learning more about Tolkien's literature and his like kind of literary philosophy, I found it impacting how I was reading the Old Testament. And then as I was reading the Old Testament more, I found myself being informed more about how I was reading Tolkien at the same time. And so for about like 15 years, this has been a kind of a personal dream of mine to teach a course on Tolkien in the Old Testament. So this is really fun for me. I'm very excited about the space and the opportunity to do this. So let's get into some of the things that are common between Tolkien and the Old Testament. So one of the kind of big ideas that I'm going to interact with in this course is the idea that there are systematic similarities and differences between Tolkien's legendarium and the Old Testament as large bodies of literature. So some of those common literary features are things that often people find difficult about both about Tolkien and about the Old Testament. So I'm just going to give a brief overview here. First of all, that there's multiple names for people and places. It's a common feature both of Tolkien's literature and the Old Testament. Just a couple examples are the character of Aragorn. Like when we meet Aragorn, he's not called Aragorn, he's called Strider, and those two names get interchanged. In the Old Testament, we have two. The character of Jacob is also called Israel, and those two names are also interchanged. Um, we also have multiple literary genres compiled. Uh, um, in Tolkien's work, like in The Lord of the Rings, in the chapter A Knife in the Dark, Aragorn is sitting by the fire and he breaks into song and he's singing what appears to be the Lay of Lathian, which is an elvish tale. Right, but it's very different. It's a very different um, genre and style from the prose we've been reading to now in this high rhyming verse. The similar thing happens in many meetings where they're at Rivendell and you get the story, right? You get a retelling of the story of Eärendil by Bilbo in metrical and rhyming verse. And we see the same thing in the Old Testament as well. Um, so, for example, in Exodus 14 and 15, in Exodus 14, we have a prose account of the Red Sea Exodus. And then the very next chapter in Exodus 15, we have the song that the Israelites sing about that battle. A very similar thing happens in the book of Judges, where Judges 4, we have a battle of Deborah the judge over the Canaanites. And then in the very next chapter, now you have a poetic retelling of that battle in very high language. A similar thing happens in the book of Jonah, which is a prose story, but then almost all of chapter 2 is this formal poem that is uttered by Jonah in the belly of the fish. Um, we also get multiple versions of stories. Uh, so, for example, in Tolkien's literature, like the entire story of Lord of the Rings is retold in the Silmarillion, in the passage called "Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age." But it's told from a different perspective, right? It's told from the Elvish perspective, and so there are differences. There are some differences in those two retellings. Of course, the Lord of the Rings is much longer. But the same thing happens in the Old Testament too. Uh, so the probably the biggest example is that we get the history of the nation of Israel told twice. So first in long form in the books of Samuel and Kings, and then it's retold again at a later point in their history in the books of Chronicles, both of which are recorded in the Old Testament. And then finally, one of the things that I think is in some ways the most challenging, or one of the most challenging features, is that we have non-chronological reference to time in both of these works of literature. So a good example is in the Battle of Pelennor Fields in Return of the King. After the battle, right, the narrator tells us that where Theoden's horse dies, like flowers continue to grow for a long period of time. And then at the end of the chapter, we have this song that is obviously penned much later, right? It's a song of from Rohan. The narrator has included it. But obviously happened much later than the events at which we are reading in that moment. And the same thing happens in the Old Testament, as some with some regularity. So, for example, um, in the story of Noah, we have reference to clean and unclean animals, which the Old Testament doesn't even inform us at all about what clean or unclean animals are at all until two books later in Leviticus. The same thing happens with Moses. Moses says he keeps when the story of manna coming from heaven in the wilderness, he keeps a pot of manna and they put it in the Ark of the Covenant, but the Ark of the Covenant hasn't been made yet. And so we see in these narratives, we see different things going on in regard to time. So all these are things that are on the surface that that are similarities between these two bodies of literature that make it very interesting and make them compelling to compare and to contrast. So where I had this kind of the jumping off place for this really for this course is from this quote that I've taken from On Fairy Stories, Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, fairy stories. He says in that essay that history often resembles myth because they are both ultimately of the same stuff. On the surface, this makes sense because Tolkien himself says, right, he's not out to just write a story. He's out to write a history, right, to invent a secondary world and then offer a history of that world. So he says himself he's doing a very similar thing that historians do in writing the story of of a world, whether it be the primary world or whether it be a secondary world. Um, and in, so it's worth investigating what's behind this, right? What's behind this impulse to tell the story, whether it be tell the story of a primary world or to tell a story of a secondary world. Um, and in Tolkien's poem Mythopoeia is really where he begins to in a crystallized form to really talk about this impulse and what's behind this impulse. And I'll say just this is a plug for the Tolkien Professors podcast that in what I'm about to present here, this is very much building off Dr. Corey Olson. And if you're not familiar with the Tolkien Professor podcast, you should go find it and go all the way back to the very first class that's on that podcast that Dr. Olson taught at Washington College. On Tolkien, and you will see there's lectures there about Tolkien's essay on fairy stories and on Mythopoeia. I'm very much building off that material. I think Dr. Olson was exactly right in how he understands Tolkien as he talks about in those lectures. But I'm going to point to this single couplet that's found in Mythopoeia, that this is what story makers are doing. This is what Tolkien says. They are digging the foreknown from experience and panning the vein of spirit out of sense. So if I could summarize what Tolkien's saying there is that there's more to our experience than just what we can ascertain with our senses. And he's suggesting that that's what story makers are doing, right? Or myth makers, that the act of myth making, which is what Mythopoeia means. This is what we're doing. We're trying to take from our senses what we can ascertain and trying to understand what is foreknown, the spirit of that. In technical speak, we call that metaphysics, which is the science of things transcending what is physical or natural. Um, there's a famous line, of course, in The Lord of the Rings where Sam and Frodo are in Mordor and the clouds part and Sam can see through the clouds, right, a star. And there's this line, right, that Tolkien says in the narrative at that point, that the shadow, right, he realizes the shadow is only a passing thing, but there's light and high beauty that are beyond its reach, right? And this is the idea, right, and the idea of metaphysics, that there's more to our experience than just what we can ascertain with our senses, and that's what we're trying to get at. Um, So to take a brief review of the story of Tolkien's mythology and then the story of the Old Testament, um, uh, the stories have a similar kind of track. So Tolkien's mythology, we start with Iluvatar, who makes the Ainur. The Ainur make the music, the Ainur see the vision, and then Iluvatar proclaims Ea, which brings everything into being. Uh, Along the way, at the end of the first age, we find the character of Eärendil, who initiates the War of Wrath. Morgoth, the primary enemy, is vanquished and shoved into the void, and that's the end of the first age. Then with the second age, we have the creation of Numenor, the special island, um, and the introduction of Sauron, who's the primary enemy in the Second Age, who forges the One Ring, and the One Ring is lost, and the Second Age ends. Of course, this is the story of Isildur and Elrond, and all of that happens at the end of the Second Age, which is 3,441 years long, Tolkien says. All right, after about 2,000 years later, then the Nazgul capture the city of Minas Ithil, and it is renamed Minas Morgul. Uh, and Minas Anor at around that time is renamed Minas Tirith, and the One Ring is found, of course, as we know from Lord of the Rings. Um, and that happens in between 2,000 and 2,500 of the Third Age. And then, of course, at the end of the Third Age, as is told in The Lord of the Rings, after 3,021 years, Aragorn becomes king of Gondor and Arnor. The One Ring is destroyed, and the Age ends. That's right in one slide. That's the story of Tolkien's legendarium. Right, if we were to put this in fairy tale speak, we could add like the three dots, and they lived happily ever after. Right. Um, the Old Testament is different, but similar. So here's a brief recapture of Old Testament, the story of the Old Testament. So you will recognize the similarities immediately, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the first line of the Old Testament. God creates the cosmos, including humanity. Humanity falls into sin. Humanity is judged in the flood, and God makes a covenant. Um, Somewhere around the year 2000 BCE, we're introduced to this character, Abraham. And God appears to Abraham and was living somewhere in the ancient Near East. God calls Abraham, and Abraham relocates to Palestine and founds the Israelite clan. Um, well, how we don't know exactly how many years later, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1400 to 1200 BCE, we're introduced to this character named Moses. Um, the Israelite clan, in the meantime has traveled to Egypt. Moses is born in Egypt. He leads the Israelite tribes out of their slavery in Egypt, and they come back to Palestine. They so they've become a confederation. They've grown. They've become a confederation of tribes. Eventually, they unite under one king. Um, David becomes king around the year 1000 BCE. David becomes king of the united Israelite nation and conquers large amounts of territory. That the Israelite nation is at its largest under King David. Um, and then we begin what might be called the long defeat, right? Over the next 500 years, essentially, right, things just get worse and worse and worse for the nation of Israel. And the substantive narrative of the Old Testament essentially ends with King Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor of Babylon, coming to Jerusalem, destroying Jerusalem and the Israelite temple, and deporting surviving Israelites to Babylon. There is a little bit more of the story after that, but essentially that's where we end. The predominant story of the Old Testament is with the conquering and destruction of Jerusalem, and which is the Israelite capital city. So, just in this few minutes of retelling this story, or these two stories rather, I hope that the primary difference between these two has become very clear. In that we come when we look at Tolkien's mythology, the story of Tolkien's world has a happy ending, right? Like Aragorn, right? The promised one, Aragorn comes and he becomes king and he uh saves the day, as it were. Um, Right. The story is very definitely has a happy ending. Um, If you've read on fairy stories, you know this notion of the happy ending. This is important for Tolkien's kind of literary philosophy. Um, but contrast that with the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a tragedy. It is not a comedy, right? It's a story that has a profound sad ending, right? Like, um, if you take the Old Testament story in literary analysis, right, all of the things that the story is all the hopes that we as the reader have been that are being awakened in us as we read the Old Testament. None of them come to pass, right? Like we are left with disappointment and despair. Um, that's how the Old Testament ends, which I find very compelling as a difference, as a difference between these two long works of literature that are presented to us. Right, one has a happy ending, very deliberately has a happy ending, and Tolkien tells us there's meaning to be found in this happy ending, but not so with the Old Testament. Um, if I can borrow a line from Lord of the Rings, this is something that Sam says specifically in reference to the story of Beren and Luthien. As he is retelling it, or as they are thinking about it in The Lord of the Rings. This is what Sam says. He says, "That's a long tale, of course, and goes on past the happiness and into grief and beyond it." Um, right, as you read this line, you should be thinking of all these things that we've been talking about here in these last few minutes, right? Of metaphysics and things that are beyond our experience, beyond our senses, right? Sam is saying this story is it's long, and it's not just a happy tale, but it's long enough that where you get past happiness and you get into grief. Um, but it doesn't end with the grief. It keeps going into whatever is beyond grief, right? The from On Fairy Stories, the word that Tolkien uses is joy. There is a joy beyond grief. Um, but the Old Testament does not do that, right? The Old Testament is also a long tale, and it goes on past the happiness and into grief. Full stop. Um, so one of the things that I want to explore in this course has to do with this fundamental difference between these two works of literature. What does this have, right? The fact that the Old Testament leaves us in grief and despair. Um, how does that instructive for us? How does that help us understand the characters that are in that story? Um, and how does that help us? How does that help us shed light on what Tolkien himself is doing in his own stories? Um, Okay, so that's kind of a taste of where we're going. Here is a this is a brief overview what the course is going to cover. So in terms of the kind of systematic similarities and differences between Tolkien and the Old Testament, I see them occurring in kind of three venues. So literary, meaning like things that have to do with the text itself, or the texts themselves as they're presented to us. Comparing and contrasting the use of archetypes, comparing and contrasting the use of typology, and then comparing and contrasting the reality of textual criticism that are in uh, both of these works that have a manuscript history and right, like it's a history before the actual textual product that we have. Then in the second venue, what I call mythological, uh, yeah, which is really a synonym for metaphysical in this case. So the realities of our experience, what is the meaning that we attach to them? So the ideas of salvation and judgment that are in both the Old Testament and in Tolkien's writing, and then the reality of death and life. Predominantly, what we should be thinking of is the notion of resurrection, right? Like in the story of Beren and Luthien, we have a human character who dies and who rises again from the dead, right? Not very many stories cover resurrection, right? Um, but we have the same thing occurring in the Old Testament as well. We have people who die and come back to life. That's significantly noteworthy. Just as a literary phenomenon. Well, what's the meaning behind that? And then finally, what are some of the theological similarities and differences? Um, Most especially, right, the idea of the assumption of a divine being um, in both these stories, right? Tolkien just flat out tells us there's a divine being in his world, a Luvatar. Same thing with the Old Testament. Old Testament presumes the existence of a divine being called God. So in that section, we'll be talking about what are some of the similarities and differences about the human condition as it is shown in these two works of literature, and then
Dr. Ruark,
similarities and differences in the divine being.
I
Yes,
apologize. Just giving you a 5-minute warning. Also, we have a couple
yes.
of questions in Zoom chat if you have the opportunity to address them.
Oh, perfect. Yes, give me yes.
You got
I'll
that.
do that in just a second. I will once I can get back to my the Zoom screen. Okay, so these are the texts that we'll be using. This is on the website. Um, uh, we'll be looking at Tree and Leaf and the Silmarillion, Lord of the Rings. Um, we'll also be reading some sections of both Unfinished Tales and the Children of Hurin. And then, of course, we'll be reading selections from the Bible. Um, if you are unfamiliar with, if you haven't read the Silmarillion or if you haven't read the Old Testament, and you want to take the course, I would highly recommend using either one of these summary guides. They're very helpful just to get you in the headspace of what those stories are. The narrative of the Silmarillion is going to be very important for this course. And then finally, if you want to investigate some more, I have a lecture online that I gave at the Wade Center a few years ago exploring this very topic about Tolkien mythology in the Old Testament. If you look on YouTube and you type in "unsplintering light" in the search bar, you will find it. And then finally, if you want to take the course and you want to do some preliminary reading, these would be things to do some reading beforehand. So Mythopoeia on fairy stories, of course, and then the opening works in the Silmarillion, the Ainulindale and the Valaquenta, as well as the early chapters from the Book of Genesis. Okay, so let me stop my sharing now, and all right. I am. Oh, here's the chat. Okay. Let me just quickly go through as many as we can before we run out of time. Um, okay. Maddie Gustafson says, "Is Corey's lecture on fairy stories still available?" Yes, it is. So if you go anywhere like I use iPodcast on because I use Apple. But if you just search for the Tolkien Professor in anywhere you get podcasts, you'll find his podcast. You have to scroll all the way down to the very, very beginning because those podcasts are from way back in 2009, 2008, 2009, maybe. But you will see it's his recorded lectures he gave at Washington College on Tolkien. And he has he starts with On Fairy Stories and then Mythopoeia. Those are the first few lectures that are there. Oh, I see. Someone had addressed that already. Um, oh, this is a great question. Okay, so Teresa Hawes asks, given the professor's Christian faith, meaning Tolkien's Christian faith, how does it make sense not to include the hope for a Messiah promised in Genesis 3:15, an eternal dynasty promised to David, etc.? That hope is not despair, is it? Oh, this is a great question. So these are the kind. This is one of the things that we will get into this course. So, what I would say is that this is a very short answer to this question. Is that what I would say is absolutely the messianic hope is present in the Old Testament. However, when we get to the end of the story of the Old Testament, it is in doubt whether this promise will actually be fulfilled or not. Um, so I know that right. I know it's I'll make no bones about the fact that right, I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus. So I do in fact read the Old Testament from a Christian perspective. Um, but But when we read the Old Testament and you get to the end of, right, the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, it seems very clear to me that the Israelites who are living that history, right, that's a genuine crisis of faith that they go through, right? Like they are really struggling with, is their faith in Yahweh, their God, to be justified? And what's going to happen with these promises that they believe God has made to them? Um, so that's my short answer. But what I would say is that if you're really interested in this, please by all means take the course, because we're going to talk about this more. This notion of Jesus and Messiah, and how does that play out?
All right. Thank you very much for that very intriguing session. And to everybody who participated with your questions and your answers. If you're interested in going in deeper in the subject, please check out Dr. Ruark's full module in June 2025, which is available for enrollment now. Also, if you add the course to your wish list, we'll keep in touch with you about it, and we'd love to have you see you as part of the class. Finally, please check out our info in the Zoom chat and from Jenny, and for all the info links about the full module, our space program, and how to get in touch with us.